A bunch of transfer portal players are already off the board, but don't worry. If your team's still in need, there's great options available to you. Don't panic. Don't settle.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. We're your hosts. That's Andy Patton. I'm Isaac Shade, and you've joined us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. We want to thank you for making us your first listen or watch. A reminder that you can catch every episode ad-free on Amazon Music. Special shout out to all you everydayers out there, as well as all the members of the Locked On College Basketball Discord community. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Andy, super fun show today. We're going to take a look at the best remaining transfer portal players on the board, in our opinion. And that's a very kind of subjective things. Yes, there are some level of objectivity to it, but that's okay. So remember, this is our opinion. We'd love to hear yours too, though. And I think, Andy, this is such an important thing to do because it's felt like there's been the flurry of movement and activity, but there are still so many great guys out there. And it's kind of like the mid to late rounds of a fantasy draft. That's some of your most important pickups are the guys that come after the initial flurry. So this is really important stuff that we're talking about. To timestamp this thing, because movement happens all the time, we're recording at 5 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. Here's how we're going to handle it, the conceit, how we're breaking this up. We're going with guys that we think will be back in college. So maybe they're in the NBA draft process, but we think ultimately they come back. And obviously guys that have not yet committed and we think will commit by the time this comes out on Friday. So obviously if there's a guy we don't talk about that you think we should, it's because we think they're staying in the draft. In terms of order, we're going to start with guards, then we're going to go to wings, and then bigs. Obviously, in positionless basketball, you could slot these guys into other categories, whatever. We'll give you 3 per segment, honorable mention, and we'll mention the draft status of each of them. So 4 possibilities. Either they didn't declare, to the best of our knowledge. They declared but don't have any invites to either of the combines. They got a G League combine invite. That's May 11th and 12th, which funnels into the 4th option, the NBA draft combine invite, which is May 13th through 19th. As a reminder, players have until 10 days after the combine to pull out and come back to school. So that would be May 29th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern time to do that. So Andy, we're going to start with guards. We got 3 of them. And as has pretty much been the case all offseason long, we're talking about a former Kentucky Wildcat that might follow his former head coach. Andy, start us off.
Yeah, we're talking DJ Wagner to start things off, and really all the guards here, and frankly, almost every player that we're going to discuss on today's show has some connection to either Kentucky or Arkansas because they are either recruiting them, they used to play for them, whatever it may be. There's a reason that Kentucky and Arkansas have just dominated the college basketball headlines this offseason. But we're going to start with DJ Wagner, and I think there's certainly an argument on whether he is the best in terms of productivity, especially when compared to the other 2 guards that we're going to talk about. But the upside with DJ Wagner in particular is phenomenal. And he also has 3 years of eligibility. I don't think any team that lands him in the transfer portal is going to expect to have him for 3 years. That's just not the nature of college basketball, the modern era. But DJ Wagner's upside and potential is phenomenal. He's visiting Arkansas this weekend. He could very obviously become the 3rd player to defect from Kentucky to Arkansas, joining Zvonimir Ivisic, joining Adu Thiero, joining, of course, a plethora of players in that incoming recruiting class as well. But Wagner started 28 out of 29 games for Kentucky last year, but that was a bit surprising considering the performances of Rob Dillingham and Reed Shepherd, who are both just more productive and better than DJ Wagner. There's really not any other way to spin that. They were better basketball players than he was last year. Wagner didn't quite live up to the billing that we kind of had for him as an incoming freshman, as a highly regarded recruit. The 3-point shooting wasn't really there, but he's a 6'3" guard. He was a solid facilitator distributor. He showed flashes of excellence, particularly getting downhill and going towards the basket. And I think in the right right situation, whether that is at Arkansas or not, I don't know. But in the right situation, Wagner, I think, could find himself having a really strong sophomore year, ending up being as high as a lottery pick in the 2025 NBA draft. Nobody's going to kind of just forget about that freshman year. That's the best case scenario for Wagner. And I think if he finds the right spot, that'll be what happens for him.
Yeah. And Andy, this is somebody that is going to be in college, didn't declare for the draft. So he's going somewhere. Arkansas has plenty of money and plenty of scholarships available. So it'll be really interesting to see if he follows his coach.
I like Wagner and John L. Davis as a fit. That's the last thing I'll say on it. I kind of like that backcourt fit. I think it could be really good.
I hadn't conceived of that, but I like it. I'm right with you, Andy. I know that, Andy, you said so much of these guys are Arkansas or Kentucky related, and obviously BYU fits right into that whole conversation, and that leads us to Jaxson Robinson, who does have a combine invite out of BYU, 1 year remaining. Played at Texas A&M, at Arkansas, 2 years at BYU. Wouldn't that be funny if he went back to Arkansas? I don't think that's going to happen. But last year, 14.2 points a game, 2.5 boards, 1.3 assists, 35.4% from deep on 6.9 attempts per game. Obviously, that makes sense because he was at BYU with Mark Pope. Kentucky has obviously pursued him. Riley Kugel, as Andy talked about recently on the show, is out at Kansas, so maybe Jaxson Robinson could go there. We'll have to wait and see because, as I said, he's one of those guys with a combine invite, Andy, and so really curious what happens with him. I think it would make a ton of sense for him to wind up back in Lexington with Mark Pope, but we'll see what happens.
Big guards who shoot it as well as he does are definitely going to get NBA attention. So I think he's right to stay in that process as long as possible. He's also been in college for 4 years and far and away had the most productive season he's ever had last year with BYU. Makes sense to capitalize on that. I wouldn't be surprised if he stays in the NBA draft process, but certainly ending up in Lexington, ending up in Lawrence, Kansas. Our friend for Locked On Jayhawks, Derek Johnson, spoke about him as a potential target recently on his show. There's a lot of things that could make sense here for Jaxson Robinson. I'm very interested to see where he ends up. And also I'm interested to see what happens with our third and final guard here, Wooga Poplar. Coming out of Miami, it was kind of a really disastrous day for Miami when both Wooga Poplar and Norchad Omier entered the transfer portal. Obviously, Omier has ended up at Baylor. Poplar still out there. He has been invited to the G League Combine, not the actual NBA Draft Combine, a guy who for most of the season people had on the draft radar as like, hey, he's going to be a second-round pick. He's going to be a late first-round pick. He's kind of fallen out of that conversation despite doing really well last year. Obviously, the team did not do well for Miami, a lot of injuries, including an injury to Poplar himself, but he averaged 13 points, about 5 boards, shot 38.5% from 3 on 5.5 attempts per game. I think there is an opportunity for Wooga to find another landing spot, be in an offense that maybe more caters to his skills as a three-point shooter and really kind of light it up and put himself in the NBA after that. The schools in the mix, not a surprise. Arkansas and Kentucky are two schools that we feel like are in the mix here with Wooga Poplar. Kentucky has been in contact with them for a while. I don't know if those talks have how much they've progressed, especially after the team, of course, added Kobe Brea, another fantastic three-point shooter. But there's an opportunity for Poplar to end up somewhere and have a really strong final season of college basketball.
Andy, as we said, we'll have 3 players and an honorable mention in each category. Our honorable mention with the guards is Michigan State transfer AJ Hoggard, who hasn't declared for the draft. So same thing, will be in college basketball next year, will be his 5th season. And I think that's critical. Remember, everyone is trying to get old and stay old. That's how you win right now. And this is the last year of that COVID eligibility. So it's a big deal, at least for this one last year, to the level and extreme that it's been. So one of the true veteran guards left on the board. So if you're particularly a team that's young, that needs some veteran leadership, or a team that's already old, but needs just a pass first guy to facilitate, man, that's where I'm going to AJ Hoggard. Big bodied guy, 6'4", pass first point guard, 5.2 assists last year, can really get into you defensively when he decides to, which, I know Coach Izzo was on him about that at times. The problem is a little bit of an inconsistent jumper, so you wouldn't really want to pair him with not, a lineup that isn't much of a shooting lineup. Last year was 34.7% from 3, but 10.7 points. He can score a little bit when he needs to as well.
Well, maybe you are a fan of a team that doesn't need any more guards, but you're looking for a wing. You're looking for somebody who can play out on the perimeter. If that's the case, we've got you covered in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Game Time, folks. We are in the midst of the NBA playoffs going on right now. And if you're out there and you're like, I want to see how I can get myself to a game, well, good news. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. And prices on the Game Time app, trust me on this, they actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. And if you're somebody who's concerned about your tickets being fake because you bought them from another third-party marketplace, use Game Time because their ticket coverage is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. Personally, I love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Isaac, moving on to talk, instead of talking about specific backcourt additions, guards, we're talking more about the wings. And this is kind of like you talked about the interchangeable positionless basketball. These guys could kind of be qualified in a handful of different ways. And we're looking at a group of guys who primarily are all in the NBA draft process. And we'll see, I think the majority of these guys are going to return to school, but wings, particularly the big-bodied wings are really highly coveted in the modern NBA right now. So even guys who maybe weren't as productive or whatever, if you have the right size in the frame, the NBA is going to give you a strong look. And that actually leads perfectly into the player that I want to talk about, who has not gotten a lot of NBA attention this past season, but is somebody who has been on the radar for a couple of years. That's Dillon Mitchell, who has entered the transfer portal out of Texas, spent the last 2 years with the Longhorns, was an extraordinarily highly regarded prospect when he started his career at Texas. But in the last 2 years, while his performance got significantly better from year one to year two, he still has shown literally no ability to shoot from the outside. And I say literally because he is 0 for 8 in his career from three. He has never made a three-point shot. He did not even take one as a freshman, and he shot like, I think, 40.5% from the free throw line as a freshman. It is kind of shocking to be talking about a player in this capacity as an elite transfer portal option, as somebody who does have NBA aspirations, who has been viewed by scouts as a future NBA player, who has no jump shot. He's a unique profile. He's a great defensive player, long, strong, very big-bodied guy, averaged about 10 points, 7.5 boards last year for the Longhorns. He's set to visit Cincinnati this weekend. And I'll tell you this, Isaac, I really like that fit for Dillon Mitchell. If this ends up happening, if you're listening to this and it's already happened, great, because they're returning basically everybody. They got a dominant shot-blocking big in Aziz Bandaogo down low. Their backcourt's pretty much coming back. The only loss is Victor Locken, who transferred to Clemson. He was their starting power forward. You just kind of slot Dillon Mitchell into that small ball four role, and I think things really work well for him. He's a unique player who needs the right situation to thrive. He did declare for the draft, but Isaac, no invite to the NBA Combine, no invite to the G League Combine either. Seems pretty likely he's going to be in college basketball next year. Wouldn't shock me if he's playing for Wes Miller and the Bearcats.
Andy, it feels pretty good that you and I have hit the same amount of career threes as Dillon Mitchell. I've got to be honest with you. Next, we want to talk about Arthur Kaluma, who had played 2 years at Creighton and then transferred and played for Kansas State this past year, and Jerome Tang. He's one of these guys where it's like, I mean, I guess compared to Dillon Mitchell, he sets the world on fire from deep. 36% on, from three last year, and can do a little bit of these things, or I guess in totality last year was 34.5% from three, 14.4 points, 7 boards, 2 assists, just under a steal a game. With Kaluma, I mean, again, another one of these guys that's got a lot of experience, can add so much to your team. That those 7 rebounds, he's really good on the offensive side of rebounding, and that's somebody I'd love to have in my system that way. He because of his body type and size and capability, can really finish through contact. So if you're looking for like that Kobe Brea, that Cade Tyson type shooter that have been in the portal, none of these guys we're talking about yet are that. But there's some other things that Kaluma does really well. A bunch of those like intangibles that I would really love. He's in the NBA draft process. Was a late portal addition. It's similar to some of these other guys we're talking about. Doesn't have an NBA combine invite, but does have the G League combine invite. So we'll have those 2 days on May 11 and 12, and then maybe can get funneled into the big one if he does well enough there. We'll wait and see.
Yeah, one of those guys who I think when you see those late transfer portal additions, it's guys who kind of had their heart set on the NBA and then for whatever reason over the next couple of weeks decided, I want to expand my options. I want to make sure that if I decide not to go to the NBA, that I'm not stuck only going to, going back to the same school. I don't blame guys for that because, again, I don't know specifically with Kaluma, but if you declare for the draft and the team starts preparing to replace you, you should prepare to not necessarily go back to the same school. Like, I think that makes sense for all parties involved. And I think it makes sense for Kaluma here. Should be a long list of suitors for him if he does decide to return to college basketball. And that's going to be the same situation with our last guy here, Jamir Watkins, out of Florida State. What an incredible talent that Watkins is, and a guy who really blossomed last year. It is rare to see players, quote unquote, transfer up. And I don't really like that phrase, but it helps people understand what we're talking about. He goes from VCU to Florida State, ostensibly a player who does well at the A10, is not going to have better numbers in the ACC, but Jamir Watkins did. He was really, really productive last year for the Noles, 15.5 points per game, 6 boards, about 3 assists, about 2 steals. He's got 1 year of eligibility remaining after spending 2 years at VCU and then this past year with the Noles. He's in the NBA draft process, and he did get a combine invite, so he will have the opportunity to compete with the top NBA draft prospects. Isaac, it would not shock me if Watkins does well enough at the combine to start seriously turning some heads. And I think a larger part of this conversation for the draft guys in particular is that this is a weak class. And I don't think it's going to take much to go from, hey, he's a guy who's kind of a fringe prospect, not really on the radar, maybe an undrafted guy, to having one good week. All of a sudden you're in the early second round conversation. Like, I really think that there's a jump that can be made there for guys. And Watkins strikes me as somebody who could do that. If he doesn't, and he returns to school, lots of programs could use a player with his overall skill set after such a strong year last year with Florida State.
And he's so consistent for the Seminoles on a team that just really, frankly, wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, I was looking at his game logs the other day. Scored in double figures in their final 18 games, scored 7 or points, had like 2 points in their first game of the season, scored 7 or more in every game after that, and only scored under double figures 5 total games. I mean, just really consistent for that inconsistent team. Led Florida State in just about every statistical category. Really, really good stuff. Our honorable mention in this category goes to Trevon Brazile. We think he's like a little bit more likely than some of the other guys to stay in the NBA draft. Did get a combine invite, but Andy, the reason I would think not is 2 years ago, he was incredible for Arkansas before that unfortunate injury. Returning from that this year, he just wasn't quite the same.
No.
And I think part of this for me is wondering, could he use another year to come back? Almost like a contract year that you see in the professional league sometimes, where it's like a guy's playing on that 1 year contract to kind of get a bigger one.
Yeah.
Would it, a lot of times with these lower body injuries, it's like the year after you get hurt where you come back and just do it right and do it really well. And so, Andy, I think he could be well served to come back, play in college one more year, prove that he still is the guy that he was before that injury. And despite the weak draft class, still, because of everything he showed that year before, could really rocket up draft boards.
6'9" forward, good shot blocker, not super consistent, but at times a very good 3-point shooter. The profile is there for him to not only be an NBA player, but to also be a really, really strong and successful college basketball player. If he's fully healthy, if he's in the right system, I could see him exploding and having a phenomenal senior year. Who knows? Lots of schools should be involved in a guy who's got his size, his pedigree, his athleticism. And I think that we will end up seeing, if he does return to school, we will see a huge list of suitors lining up for him, because I think he could have a really big impact next year.
And I think that'll be the case for a lot of these guys that maybe ultimately pull out of the draft, because it's like by supply and demand, it's like, oh, these are crazily talented guys that maybe weren't on the board at the beginning of the transfer portal frenzy. And so now here they are, and we got money to spend. Let's do it. Well, Andy, one such player that, by the way, is in that same boat is Coleman Hawkins from Illinois, who shook up the wish list wish lists for every college basketball team in need of a big when he entered the portal, basically at the portal entry deadline. Where might he end up? We'll talk about it coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about Monopoly Go. Okay, hang on. Whoa, time out, game off. We got to pause right here and talk more about Monopoly Go. And look, I know what you're saying. Shade, flag on the play. You've already been talking about this so much. And I know, I hear it, I get you. But there's so much good stuff in Monopoly Go. We got to keep talking about it. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with your friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. And the more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock, like unique stickers you can trade with your friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new pieces that you can travel the game boards with, or hilarious emojis to taunt your friends when you smash their buildings. Plus, Monopoly Go really does feel like new and exciting every day, constantly changing tournaments and challenges. And a ton of those have their own unique mini games, like where you can dig for treasure. And they've always got these new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench, go download it right now for free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. One more grouping of guys we want to talk about. If that last set was more wings, or we could call them threes or fours, this group is really fours and fives. We'll call it the bigs. Again, positionless basketball. It's really hard to categorize this. It's like genres in music, right? Like, what is alt rock's British punk style? I don't know. Anyway, for Andy, we got some really intriguing names here that I'm really interested to see. And we're going to start, as I mentioned, with Coleman Hawkins, who was in the NBA draft, dead set on this is where I'm landing. And then basically right at the deadline enters his name into the transfer portal. At the time, it seemed like just a butt covering thing. As you mentioned with one of the players earlier, I forget who it was now, but just to basically say, I think it was Kaluma. Like if I do come back, I might still want to go back to Illinois, but I want to have my options open. And Andy, this is a dude that I would think will command an absolute bag if he does come back. In fact, earlier this week, CBS Sports' Matt Norlander reported that he thinks it's a very likely scenario that Hawkins does come back. And some of the four suitors he mentioned, obviously it could be more than this, are Arkansas, hello, again, Chicken Man, North Carolina, Kansas State, and Louisville. Of course, he could, as I said, return to Illinois. He could stay in. His draft prospects aren't great from a lot of the mock drafts we're seeing. And so, yeah, come back, get yourself a bag, makes a ton of sense. He does have an NBA draft combine invite, so it could be, as we record, essentially 20 days before we know if he'll be back to college basketball or not. He's a grad transfer with 1 year remaining. Played 4 years at Illinois. Last year, 12.1 points, 6.1 boards, 2.7 assists, 1.5 steals, just over a block a game. Can step out and shoot it a little bit. Andy, I think for the majority of teams, he would profile more as a 4, but certainly can and will play small ball 5 when necessary. At the next level, I think he's more of a 4, and so that plays into it. And I think he gets a bad reputation for some of what he does on social media. I actually had a conversation with Cam Salerno from CBS Sports yesterday, and he said, who grew up like 15 minutes from Coleman Hawkins, and said, look, this is a kid from a great family. He just likes to troll people on social media, and people take it bad. I think Coleman Hawkins is a guy you want in your program, that you love it when he's on your team, and he probably annoys the stew out of you if he's an opponent.
My guess with Hawkins is that the reports that he's getting from scouts and analysts are basically, for 3 years, you weren't a shooter. You weren't a three-point shooter. Your free throw percentages were under 68% in all those years. You didn't profile as somebody who could step out and space the floor. And then in your senior year, he did. And like, kudos, great for him. He shot 37% from three. Yeah, he was 79% from the free throw line. He like magically got touch over one offseason where all of a sudden the three-point percentage and the free throw percentage ballooned up in a significant way. I think scouts might be a little hesitant to put a lot of stock in whether that's going to be sustainable long-term. But guess what? If he goes to Arkansas or Carolina or Kansas State or Louisville or back to Illinois or somewhere else, and he shoots 37% from three again, he's going to boost his draft stock, because 6'10" dudes who can do that are exceedingly rare. I can understand being hesitant about him only doing it, 25% of the time in his career up to this point. But one more year of doing that, you get yourself a big NIL bag, and then you make yourself a bunch more professional money if you can prove that you can shoot it again for a second straight year. Looking ahead, another big man here from the mid-major ranks, JT Toppin out of New Mexico. Kind of a bit of a player that sort of burst onto the scene, as it were, for New Mexico. The expectation was that Jamal Mashburn Jr. and Jalen House were going to be the two players that kind of led Richard Pitino's team, and they had their moments last year, but JT Toppin was the best player on that team as a true freshman big. He averaged about 12.5 points, 9 boards, 2 blocks per game. He's a rim protector. He's a great rebounder. He's a low post scorer. He showed a little bit of the ability to shoot the three, but it was not a very large sample size. So I think there's some question marks about how translatable that is, but his age is going to make him very appealing to the NBA. He did declare for the draft. He did get an NBA Combine invite. I think the general expectation is that he will return to school. And with the big man market kind of depleted in the transfer portal with so many of the players, with guys like Omir and Adu and Omaruyi who've already committed, like there's a lot of teams that are really desperate to add a player like JT Toppin to their team. So I could see him getting attention from the North Carolinas of the world and from some of those other top tier programs. But the NBA is going to give a really long look to him because of his age and shot blocking ability and what he was able to do last year for New Mexico.
Andy, next, I want to turn our attention to somebody he's just great, Andy.
Just great. So great.
So great that's his name. Great Osobor, Mountain West reigning player of the year from Utah State. Look, this dude has followed Coach Danny Sprinkle around to both schools so far, 2 years at Montana State, last year at Utah State. Hasn't declared for the draft to our knowledge. There was some Kentucky talk for a while. We think that he's off of that. He could follow his coach for another time, going up to Washington. He's visiting up there. It was at Louisville as well last year. 17.7 points a game, 9 rebounds, 2.8 assists, 1.4 blocks, 1.3 steals. I mean, he's just an absolute dude. He's got really good hands. One of those, a little bit of an undersized big, kind of think a little Norchad Omiri maybe, but makes a living at the free throw line, at least in terms of getting there. Andy, last year, 8.1 attempts per game, but only made 63.7% of them. So, has to grow in that. You talked about Coleman Hawkins with it, but I think he's somebody that is, look, wherever he goes, it's going to be a great addition. I know a lot of people, as you talked about, like with Jamir Watkins transferring up, not worried at all with great Osobor. Wherever he lands, he's going to be in good shape.
If Osobor ends up at Washington, for starters, he's played really well for Danny Sprinkle, so why not keep that train going, move to the Big Ten? It makes a lot of sense to me. If Kentucky's no longer interested, great. Seems like a really great fit at Washington, and I think that would work out really well for him and the Huskies. The final player to talk about here, our honorable mention, is Ugonna Onyenso from Kentucky. He declared for the NBA draft and was just dead set. I am playing professional basketball next year. I am not returning to college. And then a few weeks later, he suddenly entered the transfer portal. Presumably, he got some feedback that like, hey, we'd like to see, maybe a little bit more from you in the college ranks, maybe end up in a situation where there's more minutes for you and you're playing a bigger role, because he just never really had that while under John Calipari at Kentucky. Onyenso has received a G League Combine invite, so if he plays well there, he could end up getting into the NBA Draft Combine, could very well end up staying in the pros. That's part of the reason he was our honorable mention. But if he does return to college, he will be a highly sought-after player in the transfer portal because he is probably the best remaining defensive center in the transfer portal. He is an incredible athlete and a high-level shot blocker, and any team that needs a defensive anchor is going to throw a bag and a half at Onyenso if he decides to return to college basketball next year.
Yeah, Andy, I mean, and as you said, it's like you wonder, it's another one of those new place, fresh eyes, get a restart and just be a dude, right? Like I know at Kentucky, we talked about how bad their defense was last year, except when he was in the basketball game, right? Like just things were a lot better with him in there. 2.8 blocks a game last year, could do just a lot of really good stuff. So I'm curious to see where he winds up. Man, there's a lot of possibilities with what Onyenso's bringing. And truly, Andy, out of this list of 4 guys that we've talked about, he really is the only like true honest to goodness center on it, 7-footer, and so good stuff there. It's been great to be together today on Locked On College Basketball. We want to thank you so much for joining us to wrap up your week. We'll have another great string of shows next week, and we'd love for you to join us there as well. If you haven't subscribed to the show on audio and video, please do so. It's very easy to do. If you haven't joined the Locked On College Basketball Discord community, we'd love to have you there. It's free, and the link is in the show notes. As always, we want to say apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. Have a great weekend, everybody. And until Monday, peace.